Warning. This mega campaign contains immensely cursed things like the Hiberno-English-British Empire, the Ponto-Mongols of the Black Sea, and the Palestinian-Arabian Crusader State Union. That being said, when I converted this game from CK3, I did go into the game files and clean up the borders, so although this will have a cursed countries trigger warning, the borders are actually kind of nice. Enjoy. In a few centuries leading up to the rise of Napoleon, there's really no end of chaos, destruction, and opportunity. While the particular circumstances around which many great figures in the early modern era came about are quite unique, the stage upon which they've been set is not. No matter the unrecognizable nature of the map and its borders, the world isn't all that different. Nations are covertly forming around various nationalistic movements, and the role of religion is being diminished. While the power of the monarchs of the world certainly remains in place, they are more and more delegating their power to cliques and classes that normally wouldn't be able to touch such powerful absolute monarchs. Indeed, looking around the map, we see possibilities for all sorts of nation-states, but ultimately, there's no reason why the nationalistic wave has to come to be. It's entirely possible that the people will fail to rally around a language and land. Only time will tell how these movements coalesce, but for now, a couple notes on the EU4 section of this mega campaign. I recorded this run live, so you'll see me in the corner, and although I tried making a little mod to give small mission trees to nations of interest in this campaign, it would have taken too long due to my lack of experience. That being said, future mega campaigns may feature modded mission trees now that I've learned a bit more about EU4 modding. If you like this mega campaigns, drop me a like, sub, and comment so I know. Thanks. With that out of the way, let's jump in as Portugal, who I'm playing simply because it's who I started as in Crusader Kings 3. We will not be staying as Portugal for very long. When the Moors arrived in Hispania some centuries ago, they brought with them not just armies, but a new religion and a new language. Iberia is more or less split into three cultural spheres, with the Christian Romance speakers of Castile, Leon, and Aragon, the Muslim Romance speakers of Portugal, and the Muslim Arabic speakers of Andalusia. By far, the Andalusian Arabic speakers are the largest group, although they are ruled over by a Spanish-speaking king, Teobaldo Hakamid. To say that this is an unpopular state of affairs is an understatement. Teobaldo nominally is a Muslim, but he is neither Portuguese nor Arabic, as he was raised in the courts of Castile rather than Lisbon or Cordoba. Teobaldo is facing a choice with his realm. He can stick to his Castilian roots, or embrace his subjects' desires and shift the realm away from the uneasy peace cradling Iberia. Calls for the completion of the Islamic Conquista of Hispania are all that the influential nobles discuss, and under that pressure, Teobaldo gave in. The Kingdom of Portugal was dissolved in November, replaced by the new Kingdom of Andalusia, which firmly shifted its diplomatic stance towards the conquest of Iberia. Teobaldo remained king, but he took something of a backseat to the whims of his nobles and peasants, who immediately got to work preparing for a great war against the remaining Christians of Iberia. All of this autonomy within his realm are represented as all the privileges being granted to the states, who were more or less acting as the real drivers of the realm under their figurehead king. The first conquest target for Al-Andalus was Leon, which was diplomatically isolated thanks to Christian infighting. During a war, Teobaldo's nobility accidentally, so they claim, assaulted a traveling Welsh Castilian noble making a pilgrimage to Santiago, which was a great insult to the northern Spaniards, yet the absolute destruction of Leon told the Christians that they didn't have much choice in the matter. Nonetheless, the Welsh Castilian king put forward a petition of formal complaint, which was ignored by Andalusian authorities. Instead, Andalusian maps were preemptively updated to include lands as far north as the Pyrenees, implying a coming conquest. After 11 months of fighting, Leon surrendered, ceding all its land outside of its core of Asturias and Leon, and accepting Andalusian overlordship. Seeing the power of the Muslim Iberian south, France and Castile signed a treaty of alliance, which was a powerful deterrent for the war-hungry Andalusians. Their fervor was curbed to some extent when Teobaldo insisted that war not break out between Little Andalusia and the entire Christian world, which was a shared sentiment across the war cabinet. The Frankish Empire was dealing with its own problems, reigning in its more autonomous French appanages, seeking to Germanize its core territory, but it was quite likely that even in its own turmoil, the Franks could easily handle Andalusia's relatively small army. Teobaldo, looking to earn a better perception in the eyes of his lords, promised that he could handle the French and their support of Castile as he got into his royal carriage and made a personal trip to Paris. After some conversations with the French king, Teobaldo came to an agreement with them. They penned a treaty, intended to last in perpetuity. The Andalusian kingdom shall never cross the Pyrenees Mountains nor exert its influence over any realm north of the mountains. In return, the Frankish Empire will promise to defend Andalusia and give it overlordship of everything south of the Pyrenees, similar to the Treaty of Tordesillas, except a horizontal line instead of a vertical one. In a way, this was intended to keep the Andalusians contained, both for Christian Europe's sake and the Andalusians' own sake. The Sultanate was strong, but there was no reason why it couldn't fall to overextension and coalition forces from a fearful Europe. The Franco-Andalusian Treaty assured Europe that the Iberian menace was contained, at least for now. Upon returning to Cordoba, Teobaldo brought the treaty with him and told his nobles that in good time he could weasel the French-Castilian alliance out of existence, but that for now, the bellicose warriors of Al-Andalus would have to have their will to fight moved elsewhere. Where that energy went was Morocco, as control over the straits became an important issue for the burghers and the nobles, both of whom would benefit from greater land acquisitions. Most beneficially as well, Castile had allied Morocco, perhaps hoping to contain Andalusia, but instead they found themselves stuck in a war without French support. The war was focused on Castile first, with the intention of simply holding the straits with naval power until the Welsh Castilians were defeated, after which the entire Andalusian army could be focused on taking the great mountain fort of Fez. The war was going okay, briefly, but a massive defeat in Fez due to a forgotten army resulted in immense casualties for Andalusia, which was a sign for the future, as the previously unending flow of men into the army was becoming something of a slow drip. Nonetheless, the zealous soldiers continued the fight. The Andalusian army's main flaw was coming to light throughout these battles, as a skirmish in Alicante saw more than 4,000 Andalusians die to kill only 3,000 Aragonese soldiers. They won the battle, but it was certainly painful. During the war, Teobaldo's legitimacy, although nominally high, was beginning to be questioned. In the face of rising jingoism and military success, Teobaldo continued to espouse peaceful desires to his nobles. He was not so absolute a king that he could simply stop their wars, as the feudal system still gripped the Andalusian kingdom, but he was working in the background, making treaties and making the peasants feel unsure about their wars. This tension in the king's court would culminate into the brewing Andalusian civil war, represented in game as the Granadan War of Succession disaster. Before the noble coup could kick off, Castile and Aragon were pieced out, annulling treaties with France and paying minor war reparations. Seeing the realities of the coming coup, Teobaldo did try and stop it. He became a general and led the campaign in Morocco, hoping to show his military prowess as a way to shake off the accusations of war sabotage that were spreading throughout his realm. The army swung south to Ceuta in an extremely bloody battle over the straits. With Teobaldo leading, 13,000 Andalusians lost their lives in that encounter, and this time, no new peasants were coming to fill the ranks. This is because, well, there were none left, but many nobles believed this was because of Teobaldo's dovish influence and failures as a commander. Reality certainly had Teobaldo's side, as he had no influence over how many peasants were ready to die for their country, but the power holders certainly did not. During another horrific battle in Fez, the noble coup kicked off its offensive, starting in Evora. Before sending the now crippled royal army to deal with those pretenders, Teobaldo would have to finish the siege of Fez and defeat the Moroccans. Also, quick side note, sorry Yugra enjoyers, the Adamites are dying. Can we get an F in the chat for the Yugra Adamites? I don't know how they survive in the frozen wastelands there as nudists, but bless them for trying. Back to the coup, one of Teobaldo's distant cousins, Yusuf Hakimid, offered to take the throne to bring the war to an end, but he was deemed too incompetent to replace Teobaldo, and thus the war continued. Thankfully, the Fez fortress fell in August of 1453, and with that, the army could finally abandon the Morocco War with favorable terms and deal with the coup. In the peace deal, the Andalusians secured the straits and a few provinces along the coast. Before Teobaldo could prove himself against the pretender nobles, he died from injuries he sustained in Fez and Ceuta, which caught up with him in his old age. He had no heir except that cousin Yusuf, who he had already refused the throne. In his place, one of the minor noble families with a reasonable connection to the throne came to power, citing ancient connections to Andalusia and Islam. Saad I Umayyad took the throne, putting not an Umayyad on the throne, but an Umayyad. Spelling error? Possible. Entirely new family? Also possible. The noble coup by this point was still ongoing despite the change in management, since they were, by this point, traitors anyway. Although Cordoba was besieged and looked to be in danger, the new Umayyad administration waited to attack until at least a few more men could trickle into the army. The sins of the jingoistic nobles were being felt now, and the effects would only be exacerbated in the face of the coup. In January of 1453, the army finally engaged the Hakimid armies, defeating them in yet another costly victory, and ultimately routing them to Gibraltar, where, with the sea to their backs, they surrendered. The army then marched back to the occupied rebel territories and freed them, thus ending the coup, and ushering in the new Umayyad era, separate from the Umayyad era, and yes, I'm going to keep joking about that because it makes me laugh. The hawkish nature of the realm by this point had calmed down, and now Saad had an absolutely exhausted realm to manage. It was convenient that the Welsh Castilians were busy defending their junior partner Wales from England, who pounced on them after the Hakimids attacked. It's certainly unlikely that Castile could have defeated Andalusia, even if it was weakened state, but an attack would have significantly slowed the process of recovery. Of course, after even more disgruntled nobles rose up, it began to feel like maybe the Spaniards could actually be a threat, but ultimately, gaps in the army could be replaced with sellswords when needed, and so the Bascoli came in to fill the ranks. The rebels were eventually mopped up, using almost entirely mercenary manpower, but yet another coup-like disaster was on the horizon. The farms were empty, and the mercenary companies, famously cruel as they were, loved to ransack peasant farms and villages, knowing the Andalusians had no choice but to accept it, since they now formed nearly the entire army. The peasants, though, having participated as professional soldiers in many wars, were beginning to learn the ways of war, and may even be able to wage their own war at this rate. On the more positive end of things, Sa'ad Umayyad got to work driving his nation in the direction he felt it should go. He was in agreement with his predecessor, Theobaldo, that crossing the Pyrenees and making an enemy of Christian Europe would be a mistake. Instead, he was interested in further expansion into Africa and perhaps further down the African coast. Trade through the Sahara was difficult and often deadly on account of the Berber bandits and the desert itself. It would be much easier to somehow secure a port in the parts of Africa that were, as of yet, unmapped, and sail goods around the coast. He intended to explore and find these ports with the hopes of avoiding Berber raids. He established an entrepot at Ceuta to act as the final destination for these African ports eventually, after which goods could be distributed throughout Iberia and Europe in general. In 1457, the war between England and Castile ended with a relatively normal peace deal, with Wales falling into England's hands, but alongside that, England entered the Iberian world by taking the province of Vizcaya. Castile, having lost Wales, certainly still held on to its Welsh influence, since the local population of Castile had been Gaelicized a long time ago, but the Kingdom of Wales formed one of the three jewels in the Castilian crown, the other two being Castile proper and Aragon. It was an embarrassing moment for sure. After the Bascoli put down a small rebellion in Tangiers and then returned to Cordoba, sacking various cities along the way, the peasants finally had enough. Massive waves of poorly armed serfs rose up across Al-Andalus, refusing to pay their rents and tithes, and taking up arms against the Sultanate. The peasants' war was on. The Bascoli headed north, looking forward to putting to the sword a horde of simple opponents, which was exactly what they did. The massacre of Porto was condemned by just about anyone with a heart, as thousands of peasants were put to death by Jafar ibn Hussein's mercenary company, and over 10,000 were imprisoned for their treason. At the same time, Andalusian explorers looking to follow the coast of Africa got blown off course by harsh trade winds sent to the Caribbean and Brazil. At first it was feared these brave sailors were lost after they were thrown off course, but skillful navigators recruited from Portugal found their way back and were even able to draw up maps of their course. A new world had been discovered, and turns out it's completely empty, just waiting to be settled. Conveniently, there are also about 10,000 skilled farmers in prison looking for a second chance. Of course, they'll need to be kept in prison as an example for a little bit before they get released, just to instill a little more fear and loyalty first. Maybe the peasants' work could turn out to be a positive. Mustafa Azamuri was promoted to being the head of exploration and colonization for this new world, and Saad prepared to become the greatest Sultan of Andalusia. This guy is real, by the way. He's known in Spanish as Esteban de Dorantes, and he participated in a Spanish expedition from Cuba to Florida and across to the Pacific Ocean, ultimately disappearing in Hawaku. I bet that would be an amazing story to learn more about. As more peasants rose up in Andalusia, the prisoner population of Andalusia only increased, and the remaining peasants became more loyal, fearing the savage Bascoli. This was quite the symbiotic relationship for Saad, who was happy to have yet more prisoners to ship off to the New World once they were ready. In August of 1458, Saad hired a painter to go to the New World and draw up some landscapes, turn them into beautiful works of art, both for Saad to actually know what the New World looked like, and to decorate the Mosque of Cordoba, exalting Allah and all the beauty he created. All these amazing discoveries and grand plans stood starkly in the face of the actual turmoil outside the palace. The peasants were not at all happy, but rather than focus on reform or try to appease them, the Umayyad administration kept tensions high to collect more and more prisoners for the colonies. To stoke the flame, Saad declared war on Castile, looking to conquer more land and force the peasants into yet more wars. Dead sons and fathers would surely worsen the situation. This was an era of Andalusian history that saw great prosperity at the cost of the lives of so many, but what it would amount to, for some, could be worth it, as the first colonizers landed in Cape Verde, hoping to use it as an outpost to reach the New World. In 1462, right on the new year, Castile was defeated, and all of Valencia, Aragon, and some of Castile itself was annexed, shoving a wedge between the two crowns and putting Andalusia up to the Pyrenees. So long as they don't cross, they'll be obeying their treaty obligations. Nonetheless, a small coalition of Europeans was beginning to form, albeit with France as an ally. Juggernaut Andaluso-French alliance would not be toppled so easily. As the Peasants' War raged on, Saad slowly began replacing the Bascoli with a standing army of his own, with the intention of phasing out the divisive mercenary troops now that he had acquired enough prisoners for his settlements. The Bascoli by this point had grown fat on Andalusian wages and loot, and likely wouldn't put up too much of a fuss with all these rewards. In 1465, the standing army was partially established, and the Bascoli were reined in such that the peasants stopped their war, and order returned to Andalusia. It was painful, but even in spite of these setbacks, Andalusia only continued to prosper. Right on time, the Cape Verde outpost was complete, and with that, the proper colonization of the Brazilian coast began in Pernambuco. Now that the mercenaries were off the payroll and the nation was quite tired of war and turmoil, the Andalusian treasury was being used almost exclusively for colonization and development, as mosques and workshops across the country were built, most of which were made to replace the prosperity lost at the hands of the mercenaries. For some years, this focus on the establishment of new monastic orders and the shipping of people and goods to the New World created immense wealth and stability for the realm, and Sultan Saad had ushered in a time of artistic and industrial prosperity for Andalusia, all while under threat from a growing coalition of European powers, now including England and Lombardy. Again, though, the Franks would make any possibility of war an impossibility. The previously founded entrepot of Ceuta saw itself growing not just locally, but among the nearby cities of the region. More and more merchants and settlers flocked to prepare ports and caravans for distribution of the exotic goods of Brazil. The city of Sale became a growing metropolis, acting as a sister port to Ceuta itself. By this point as well, Mustafa Azemmouri had explored the jungles of Brazil quite extensively, and yet with every map he charted, there was just more and more to discover. It felt as if this land was unending, and in good time, it would all be Andalusian in Saad's mind. Peace has held the status quo for some decades by this point, but that peace was disturbed when war with Castile broke out again, but to call it a war was somewhat dubious. The Castilians stood absolutely no chance as the professional Andalusian army stormed Burgos and quickly won the war. In this war, Castile was absolutely gutted and relegated to an enclave within Andalusia, while Aragon lost its Mediterranean islands. Soon, the rest of Iberia will fall under Andalusian control, but it was clear that the very concept of Christian Iberia had been ended. In 1481, Andalusia continued to expand its efforts to colonize in Brazil, choosing a dual path of minor wars back home to complete the Conquista of Iberia, but putting most of the state's resources into the New World. Sultan Saad assigned the ulema and the burghers roles in the colonization, having the imams handle conversion of the locals in Brazil, and the burghers handling the establishment of trade routes and distribution of new maps and charters. Every somewhat wealthy Andalusian was encouraged to invest in the colonies in a sort of proto-capitalistic system of colonization. The lands of Brazil were held by the Sultan directly, and the land there was occupied by serfs and peasants that had been imprisoned in the Peasants' War. Of course, the Sultan could not administer it all himself, so he sold and granted deeds to nobles who themselves may not have had the capital to pay for tools, seeds, and labor. As a result, the rich urbanites of Cordoba, Lisbon, Valencia, and so on would invest in lords of their choice in return for some of the profits. This was all, of course, moderately taxed at every step, generating immense revenues for the crown. Of course, all this focus on the New World did not make Saad complacent, as he saw the Sultanate of Tunis growing a little bit too large. Rather than allow this rogue Barbary state to dominate the Maghreb, Saad intervened in 1486, citing claims to Fez and much of the Maghrebi coast. Where previously Fez had been the site of an immense Andalusian death, the newly trained and much better equipped Andalusian army was now the one creating massacres in the great mountain fortress there. In July 1487, some 9,000 Tunisians lost their lives to claim only 2,500 Andalusian lives. The Andalusian advance continued to Tilimsan and Oran, and during that campaign, the colonial ventures of Brazil got to such a size that a new administration was set up there with the intention of facilitating the continued development of the land. The self-governing colony of Al-Brasilia was established, which would continue to expand on its own, alongside Andalusian colonists and supports. The Tunis campaign continued even further, with the Tunisians at first expecting maybe a limited war in Morocco, but instead Tunis itself was under siege, and it looked like Saad had his eyes on the total decimation of Tunisia. The Barbary Sultanate was entirely cut off from its holdings in the west, as Saad drew a line on a map including the urban centers of Algeria, and then cutting into the deserts, in particular the gold mines of Tefilalt. Right away, another war in Morocco was declared, which actually put Tunis back at war with Andalusia on account of a pact between the two. Why Tunis chose to honor that agreement after the recent peace deal is anyone's guess, but they were about to burn again if they didn't immediately leave the war. After a few cities in Algeria fell, the Tunisians did accept a white peace and leave their Moroccan brothers to their fate. The entire western coast of the Maghreb was annexed, and Andalusia grew significantly in size. It was a sigh of relief for Europe that Andalusia shifted its focus towards Africa and the New World, although competing colonial powers might eventually wish that they hadn't let so much of this undiscovered continent fall into Muslim hands. Of course, Europe excludes Iberia in this case, as in 1494, war once again broke out, perhaps for the last time. During the war, government focus did remain on the colonies, and considering the rather diverse religious identity of Iberia, especially with the integration of the Aragonese, Catalans, and Welsh Castilians, it would be wise to try and mend relations back home. The Dhimmi, which up to now had not been granted many rights, were elevated in 1497 to have their own charter in Brazil, allowing them to escape their own persecution in Iberia to live what could be better lives off in the New World. More bodies, more labor, more trade, more everything in the minds of the administration. In October of 1499, the seemingly unending occupation of Barcelona and what remained of Castile ended with a peace deal that formally dissolved both crowns, integrating their lands into Al-Andalus. Iberia was more or less unified, with the subject state of Leon remaining, and the often ignored Galicia, which only got away with existence on account of its land's lacking value. During a war to conquer the newly released Morocco, after Tunis lost a war to Anatolia Khan in Egypt, Andalusia found itself at war with the successor state of the Romans, and in that war also had an opportunity to march east for the first time. After occupying Libya, the Andalusians traveled to lands that may have once been familiar to them, and they even saw the great splendor of Cairo. Some of the realm felt motivated to re-establish a proper Cordoban caliphate across the Muslim world, and most of it was something of an old concept no longer suited to this modern world. Despite the occupation of Cairo, and the potential for a peace deal with Anatolia Khan to perhaps move east, Sultan Saad preferred to stay focused on the west, and so only annexed Morocco in the place of Fez, confirming total Andalusian control over the western Maghreb. Starting in about 1503, Saad ordered an immense expansion of the Andalusian navy. The larger the Brazilian colony got, the more ships he'd need to transport the goods and settlers there. As well, he had been considering hostilities with England, as they held onto their port city of Vizcaya as if it were truly their core territory. Vizcaya, though it be Welsh Castilian, was certainly geographically an Iberian province. The only problem was that England was in a coalition with Tunis and Lombardy, which could prove dangerous. The plan was put on the back burner until the coalition would eventually disband. In the meantime, the realm considered its potential opponents outside of the obvious ones. Anatolia Khan had completed its conquests of much of Anatolia itself, and even took Constantinople for itself, more or less splitting up the former Byzantine Empire's borders between itself, Croatia, and Greater Armenia. Although the three-way split seemed amicable, the reality was that much of the Greek iconoclasts didn't like living under Catholic Croatia's thumb, and that in due time, there would likely one day be a war over those lands. Then there was Italy, which was more and more seeming like a good target for conquest. After all, Italy had been ravaged by French-speaking invaders for centuries now, as the south was dominated by assimilated Normans, and the north by the cosmopolitan Lombard culture. Given his people's desire for a new caliphate, and how unobtainable it was, there was potential for an equivalent offering to the fanatics of the realm. The Pope sitting in Rome had very little real power. He may have been the figurehead of all Catholics, but by the dawn of the 16th century, papal primacy had been eroded by the interests of individual countries and their desires. With the French in a long-term agreement to work with the Andalusians and the rest of Europe having no interest in Italy, Rome was open, and no one saw it coming. Andalusian ships made for Corsica, citing a claim to the island, but the true goal of the war was the occupation and conquest of Rome. Papal allies did cross the Pyrenees to try and fight, but they were too small in number to be consequential, nor could they possibly siege any mountain fortresses fast enough to break into the fields of Castile or Catalonia. In late February of 1511, Rome fell, and for the first time, in a very long time, Rome was sacked, shocking the Christian world. The Papal States did try and take Rome back, but their desperation showed their weakness, as the Andalusian army absolutely destroyed them, making every man either a corpse or a slave. The Pope then surrendered, allowing Rome and Corsica to fall into Andalusian hands. The French were, to some extent, concerned about this, feeling worried that their sphere of influence was being threatened, so they chose to jump into these new conquests as well, attacking Lombardy and calling Andalusia to help, citing their obligations to one another. Given the Lombards' frequent coalition allegiances, Saad was all too happy to fight them in a separate war to aid his French ally. In 1515, a peace was signed with much of Aquitaine being annexed to France, and the two allies coming much closer. With the coalition now dissolved, Tunis was vulnerable, and given the prosperity of the colonies, they could afford to be neglected for now, so that more of North Africa could be secured. It might have seemed logical to take more of Algeria, but instead the Treaty of Tunis saw the homelands of Tunisia taken, forcing the Barbary Sultanate into a difficult position. Without its actual homelands, they were significantly weaker. The next couple of years saw peace, as the management and integration of new territories became the realm's priority, but that peace was interrupted when in 1520, the newly formed British Union of Ireland, Scotland, and England declared a holy war, presumably to conquer more Welsh Castilian territory. The French, cowards as they are, chose to not join the war, breaking their treaty obligations and in theory, allowing Andalusia to break their side of the treaty, although they were in no position to do so for the time being. The British port of Vizcaya would be where most of the troops would filter in from, but thankfully, the recently constructed Andalusian navy would stand up quite strongly against the British fleet. Vizcaya itself wasn't much of a city as it had no fort, and so was occupied quickly. The British did negotiate an alliance with Galicia, which had been forgotten by Andalusia before, but now returned to memory rather violently. The Galician port was fortified, and so many English soldiers streamed in from Coruña. The English had even allied Croatia, which was able to occupy Rome, simply due to the Andalusians being spread too thin. Despite the numbers being against the Andalusians, they had the benefit of the Pyrenees forts and a superior navy, which meant it should be possible to come out of this war not just unscathed, but perhaps even with Vizcaya reclaimed. After a few years on the defensive, the Andalusian fleet was loaded up with a sizable force to siege London and force the British to submit. Powerful Andalusian gunpowder knocked a hole in the Tower of London and the city soon fell, but the British may have been counting on that. The overly zealous Andalusians advanced further north and were defeated with nowhere to retreat but London, where they were trapped by a larger British force. Thankfully, they were able to escape the port onto the ships, but their campaign was not done yet. The army moved to Ulster, hoping to block the strait and occupy one of the three main kingdoms of Britain. After years of occupation, Galicia was annexed in a separate piece, ensuring the tiny duchy there could never be a port of entry for enemies again. The British, having lost Ireland and their ally in Iberia, were considering peace, and the Andalusians were too. They did not want this war and had very little to gain from it. To ensure peace for good, and keeping in mind that the French broke their treaty, Andalusia took Vizcaya, as expected, but also took Munster as a port of entry in the future to threaten Britain, should they ever consider hostilities again. Although the Andalusian fleet was superior already, being able to keep a garrison of troops right on the British border would keep them wise. Now, peace could truly embrace Andalusia, which had much to gain overseas from the end of the war. Brazil had grown into a larger country than even its colonial overlord, and its immense riches were all trickling back home. Most of the Welsh Castilians were kicked out to Brazil, and by March of 1530, most of their old homelands were no longer controlled by them. Only Vizcaya would remain a real Welsh Castilian population center. Some minor wars here and there expanded the Andalusian Sultanate as Sicily and Sardinia both fell, one peacefully, one not so peacefully. Sicily itself was granted some autonomy as a March of Andalusia, in the hopes that they might act as something of an elite training ground for fierce Norman Italian warriors that could be converted to Islam. Around the same time, the French alliance was renewed, albeit warily. This time it was not so much out of friendship, but out of mutual interest, as the French betrayal could not be forgotten so soon. That alliance was quickly put to use, as the French once again attacked Lombardy. Seeing Lombardy as a natural enemy, Andalusia did help in this war. For their effort, they were rewarded in the form of conquest for Sicily across the Straits, given a much firmer control over Sicily and southern Italy for the Andalusian Sultanate. In 1540, Andalusian colonists arrived in the Cape in South Africa, and by going around Africa, the original goal of the colonial ventures from almost a century ago were starting to come to fruition. Moving trade throughout the east towards Iberia would add yet more value to the whole peninsula in addition to the New World colonies. Also, while looking around the world a bit, I spotted a Moldavia with Seculo-Norman primary culture, and in response, I got up and went to the washroom to contemplate my life as it was far too cursed. Back to Andalusia though. Control over Africa did become something of an ambition for the kingdom, as the Songhay kingdom settled the thin passage of Tuat through the Sahara. They thought they were making a good decision by doing that, but they opened themselves up to an invasion. The Andalusian forces, with the help of Berber nomads, traversed Tuat and invaded Gao to break into West Africa. The old kingdom of Songhay was subjugated and turned into a staging ground for further expansion into Africa for the future, although for now it wasn't a priority. Shortly after, the nation of Leon was integrated, as their purpose as a bastion of tolerated Christians no longer felt necessary. With that, Andalusia was reaching its true zenith. Although further expansion to Tunis was looking juicy, the coalition stood in the way, but a confident, powerful, and prideful Andalusia called the coalition on its promise and invaded Tunis despite it. This plunged the Sultanate into a war with Great Britain, Anatolia, Egypt, Croatia, and the remnants of Italy outside Frankish or Muslim influence. The army focused on Tunis, the war leader, in the hopes of destroying their armies before reinforcements from Anatolia and Egypt through Libya could become a problem. After Kabylia fell, the rest of Tunis was unprotected and quickly occupied, effectively removing them from the war. The vast majority of coalition forces crossed the seas to occupy Sicily, which in a way was exactly the purpose of the march there. Why they chose to attack the island instead of supporting Tunis is anyone's guess, but the massive armies there felt confident in their numbers. After a lost battle in Palermo, the Andalusian army retreated across the straits to safety in Calabria. While the massive force there looked scary, it rapidly became clear that in reality they were trapped on the island. This left Egypt open for invasion, and so Cairo was once again sacked. Nonetheless, Andalusian forces continued attacking the coalition in Sicily, hoping to just wear them down, but the losses were heavy and manpower low. Cairo's fall and Libya's occupation did push the Anatolians out of the war, who weren't very invested anyway. Fighting continued in Italy with what forces weren't trapped in Sicily, but the manpower pool was fading. To amend this, the Ulema called on the heritage of the Ghazis, encouraging religious peasants to rise up and fight the Christian masses in the coalition. More than 20,000 men signed up to fight and defeat the Christians. Despite so many men being trapped in Sicily, a significant army composed of Brits and Croats still threatened the Ghazis, albeit they were busy fighting in the Alps to take a Swiss fortress held by France. Given the war raging in Italy, Lombardy fell into the crossfire and found itself at war as well, and given their isolation from Britain at this point, they would stand no chance of winning. The Lombards would be a speed bump on the way to hegemony in the region for certain. Ultimately, the Tunisians were getting tired of being occupied while their allies starved in Sicily, and the Lombards fell so fast that it was as if the war never happened. Peace with Lombardy was signed in February of 1556, and shortly after they made peace with Tunis and the coalition. Andalusia obtained all of its war targets, controlling the entire Maghrebi coast and adding most of the Seculo-Norman homelands to itself. This is where Andalusia would likely peak. Sure, they could expand more and continue gaining power, but that was all on account of wise leadership and the right priorities. Things can always change on a dime when new leadership enters the picture. Throughout our 114 years playing in Andalusia, we took the Kingdom of Portugal down a road of conquest and colonization. The Andalusians under the Hakimid family had focused on their own internal matters, dealing with succession crises and peasant wars over the harsh lives they were forced to live. But with the death of Teobaldo and the end of the Hakimid family, the Umayyad family that rose in their place took Andalusia to its peak. The conversion of Iberia, the overlordship of Sicily, and the establishment of a colonial empire from Brazil to South Africa. Though the French had betrayed them, the Andalusians proved forgiving and worked together with the Germanic Franks to divide spheres of influence and defeat their mutual enemies. This is Al-Andalus. I spent a lot of time considering who to play next just because there were so many options. I had my eyes on Sweden, Kiev, Ghana, Adal, Armenia, and so many others, but ultimately my eyes landed on Oman, simply because they were a pirate republic and I'd never actually played one before in all my 2,729 hours of EU4. This is the first part of the EU4 section of the mega campaign I've been doing on stream. If you enjoyed this century of play, consider subscribing so you can see the next part where we ravage the east as the Omani Pirate Republic and take the humble republic down a unique path. Take a guess what you think will happen, unless you saw the stream already, in which case no spoilers. Also, just for the purpose of this particular video, just letting you know that this is the first part of the overall EU4 mega campaign series, which you probably already realize, but I'm uploading each part separately at first, and then I'm going to compile them into one big long video at the end. This is just so that you don't have to wait as long between videos, because I know I can take a long time to put this stuff together. It's kind of my bad, it takes me a while. So here's like a taste. Next part will come out soon, then the third part, and then we'll have the full compilation. Don't worry, it won't take as long for each individual part. Thank you for your time. Again, I'm not an expert in the game, right? So I might have trouble playing. I think we'll be okay. This is Oman. We have Captain Saeed Abbas.